Tomatoes are probably the vegetable plant in the gardens that I control the most. And I generally use fairly conventional methods of stringing these plants up and removing all the side shoots in order to try to reduce the overcrowding and to let in more sunlight and airflow, and to try to encourage the plants to concentrate on producing more fruit rather than more leaves and stems. The single vines I leave on some varieties still manage to outgrow the height of the polytunnel space, and I've used several different methods to manage these long plants in the past, but other plants seem to be a lot less vigorous. And I've wanted to explore a few different options for managing the growth of tomato plants, including letting some of the side shoots grow. So this year I tried out 5 different methods with a big crop of tomato plants in my new polytunnel to see how they compare in terms of growth and productivity and the amount of work that they take. And I'm beginning to rethink the strategies that I use for growing this crop. This past year I grew 140 tomato plants, taking up 3 full beds of the newly established polytunnel with 14 different varieties. This was the first time that I've separated out different varieties depending on the size of the tomatoes and how vigorous the plants grew, and it was the first time that I've used more than one method of managing and pruning the plants. In one bed I grew 4 tomato varieties that produce large or cooking tomatoes on plants that I've found in previous variety trials to be reasonably vigorous, and I wanted to explore growing in ways that encourage greater productivity in a shorter season. And the third middle bed was planted with 5 varieties of small to medium-sized tomatoes on plants that I've found to be very vigorous, or at least ones that seem to keep growing throughout the season. I divided this third bed into 5 different sections, with each section containing all the different varieties, but with the plants pruned in 5 different ways. Unfortunately, this experiment was hampered by poor fertility later in the season. This was a newly established polytunnel, and despite the abundance of compost and concentrated fertility that I spread over the soil, the tomato plants didn't grow well later in the season, and I didn't correct the apparent lack of fertility. And I wasn't so great at keeping up with the regular tasks of pruning or removing all the side shoots, which would have affected the growth of the plants and the ability to properly compare the different methods. So this was not a great controlled exploration, but we were still able to harvest a huge amount of tomatoes out of this polytunnel, and I learned quite a bit about the differences between the various methods of controlling and guiding the plants. The method I've used the most in the past involved removing all of the side shoots that formed in all of the plants, removing lower leaves as they started to get too old, and to wind the 1 leader or growing tip up a length of twine hung from the polytunnel structure. And when the plant reached the top of the polytunnel, I untied or unhooked it, let out some more twine, and hung it further down the wire, allowing the lower part of the vine to trail along the surface of the soil. And I would repeat this process as necessary, and looping around to the other side of the bed, allowing more of the vine to form a long loop on the surface of the soil. And the plants could keep growing for the full length of the season, some of them growing over 5 meters in length, and polytunnels only 2 to 3 meters tall. But dropping the plants in this way often meant that the fruit that was still ripening on the lower trusses were often laying directly on the soil, causing some tomatoes to rot and made it more difficult to harvest the rest. I used this fairly common dropping method with one of the sets of the more vigorous varieties of tomatoes in the middle bed, and because of the higher height of this new polytunnel compared to the older one, fewer of the ripening tomatoes ended up touching the soil. A few years ago, I started to adopt this method of dropping a single vine of tomatoes to try to support the lower parts of the plants rather than having them trail on the ground. When the plants reached the top of the polytunnel, I tied a second length of twine to the stem at about waist height and rehung it so that the bottom part of the plant was more vertical, the middle part was more horizontal, and the growing top of the plant was sloped more vertically again. And whenever the more horizontal part of the middle of the vine crossed the secondary support twine of the adjacent plants, I would add another clip to support it, and as the plants grew, they would form a type of woven basket hung off the ground. With the same kind of pruning of the older leaves and removing all the side shoots, the trusses of the tomatoes would hang below the vines, but up off of the soil, which made them a lot easier to harvest. But it was also the method that required the most amount of work, with a lot of tying and rehanging and additional clipping that wasn't needed with the dropping method. I used this hung basket method on another set of the more vigorous varieties growing in the middle bed, but the results from these plants, as well as from the plants that were simply dropped, would have benefited from a longer growing season if I had managed to adequately feed the plants. Another possibility for managing these plants is to simply cut off the growing tip of the single stem when it reaches the top of the polytunnel, to try to encourage the plants to focus on ripening the existing fruit rather than continuing to grow more flower trusses as well as leaves and vines. I tried this with some of the larger fruited varieties, where I pruned off the one growing leader when it reached the top of the twine, and continued to prune off all of the side shoots that developed as well as the older leaves. And I also tried this heavy pruning method with one set of the more vigorous plants to see how this method would work with plants that I would normally allow to grow for much longer in the season. I'd also planted the plants in this set at a much closer spacing of 25 centimeters apart, fitting 12 plants staggered along a 3-meter length of bed, which is considerably closer than the 40 centimeter spacing that I typically use down the center of the bed. I was thinking that this higher density of plants, with the 1 leader cut off when it reached the top of the polytunnel, would produce a larger crop in the same area in a shorter season, even if the total amount harvested of the plant was less. I had heard that leaving even one of the side shoots to grow would help to reduce the vigor or height of the tomato plants, as well as increasing the total amount that could be harvested from each plant. I decided to try this out with a full bed of 5 varieties that produce medium or beefsteak sized tomatoes. I left a really strong side shoot a bit higher up on the plant to grow as a second stem, and I wound the 2 leaders up separate lengths of twine attached to the same overhead wire, and pruned any growing tips when they reached the top of the polytunnel. And this method was very useful for 2 of the varieties that seemed to naturally focus a lot more on producing fruit with surprisingly little foliage, and not a lot of side shoots to remove, producing a really heavy crop with not a lot of work to manage the plants. I also used this 4th method on another set of the vigorous varieties, pruning them to 2 strong vines, which were hung from 2 separate wires so that the plants pulled out from the center of the bed. This opened up the plants a bit more, which made it easier to harvest and let more light into the center, and all of the growing tips of these vigorous plants were cut when they reached the top of the polytunnel. I had expected these plants with 2 stems to be slower growing or shorter than the same varieties with a single leader, but any difference wasn't that noticeable, which I find interesting. With the last of the 5 sets of vigorous plants in the middle bed, I decided to let the plants grow with multiple vines, as I had read that this was a useful strategy if each of the plants had enough space for all the extra stems. I planted 1 plant of each variety 60 centimeters apart and let some of the stronger shoots continue to develop. And I found this a bit more difficult and time-consuming to manage, partially because I wasn't attending to the pruning frequently enough. But these plants also seem to produce more growth to remove, with more stems producing more side shoots. I ended up with 5 or 6 vines or stems on each plant, growing up separate twines tied to the overhead wires, and more frequent attention and pruning would have helped these plants even more than with the other methods. These plants seem to produce fewer tomatoes earlier in the season, and the growing tips reached the top of the polytunnel not long after the plants that were more heavily pruned. I think these plants needed even more space to grow into, or I should have left fewer vines, and I'm not sure whether the limited impact on the height or vigor of the plants was worth the extra work. But perhaps this strategy of leaving multiple shoots to grow would be more successful on a less vigorous variety, or when I wanted to get the most out of really expensive seeds or a limited number of transplants. Looking at the average weight of the tomatoes harvested from the plants in each set, the plants with multiple stems produced a lot more per plant, and the ones that were heavily pruned were definitely lower yielding. And I do find it interesting that the 2 sets that did not have the top of the plants cut off did not produce as much. I think they were most affected by the premature end of the season, as these plants would have put in more resources earlier in the year to continue growing more leaves and flower trusses that were not able to produce fruit. And this is very apparent when looking at the yield of kilograms per square meter of each set, where these 2 methods produced a lot less. I assume that these plants would have been able to produce a lot more if they had been able to grow a lot longer, more so than with the plants pruned in other ways. And I suspect that these methods would be able to accommodate a higher density of plants, more plants in the same area. The densely spaced plants that were most pruned or controlled produced a higher yield than the plants with double or multiple stems. So there is a difference in terms of the overall yield per square meter of bed, but not so much, despite the significant difference in the density of plants. But looking at when the tomatoes were harvested, the higher density of more heavily pruned plants produced a greater yield earlier in the season. The double-stemmed plants were less, and the dropped and hung plants produced substantially less, but they all followed a fairly similar curve. But the plants with multiple stems seemed to be quite different, producing a lot less earlier on, but then rapidly catching up in the second half of the season. It seems that these plants were devoting a lot more resources to growing more leaves and stems earlier on, that only really started to produce later. After this year's explorations, if I had to pick one method to use on all tomato plants, I would probably let 2 stems develop on each plant, and then cut off the leaders when they get to the top of the polytunnel. But it would be good to repeat this type of side-by-side trial, especially to get a better understanding of how the vigorous varieties would produce if they were allowed to grow for longer and fed for most of the season. I do like the idea of getting tomato plants to produce for as long as possible to extend the season of this popular vegetable, and I hesitate to remove crops when there are still green fruit that might be able to ripen. But perhaps I need to think differently about all of this, and focus on getting a big crop with less work from a shorter season, which seems to be possible with plants that are pruned hard to a single or double stem, with the tops cut off when they reach the top of the polytunnel. This could be less work, but probably produce fewer tomatoes overall, and the plants would be encouraged to put the energy into ripening the existing fruit earlier so that the plants could be removed so that the space could be made available for another crop. But this might not make as much sense in the smaller or shorter polytunnel, where there just might not be enough height to get the decent crop, and dropping them a few times may actually be better. And if I wanted to harvest tomatoes later in the season, perhaps it's better to plant different batches at different times to be able to stagger the harvest, with only some of the plants producing into the autumn. And this would allow other spring crops to grow for longer, rather than clearing everything and planting all the tomato plants at the same time earlier in the season, and allows some earlier crops to get into the polytunnel in the autumn. With the temperate maritime climate that we have here in Ireland, tomato plants will probably always be a heavily controlled and pruned crop, and one of my favorite vegetables. But perhaps it's not a crop that I need to try to grow for as long as possible.